this is a time when there's a lot that's changing, both in regulation, in the way that science is progressing, and in the funding streams that are available to support it. And so that's what we're going to talk about. But just to open it up, I was hoping that you guys could talk a little bit about what you think is distinctive and maybe particularly wonderful about the US research environment when you think about how we do things here compared to the rest of the world, and also perhaps what some of the drawbacks are. Kind of how do you view the US system in comparison to the rest of the world?
Well, I'll be glad to start with that. First of all, you have to know I'm an optimist, and I think the system in the United States is by far and away the best system in the world. And I don't think that's an opinion. I believe to be a fact. When you think about the quality of our higher education institutions and the basic research institutions, even though we hear all the troubles, the government does care about basic research and supporting it. We have the most sophisticated regulatory environment in the world, though we have a lot of, we're going to talk about improvements in research science, et cetera, but we have the best system and one we need to work on. We have, in most cases, the best intellectual property system. Not the best in all cases. We've got areas to do. We have a gem in our economy from the biomedical research industry. Academic medicine is the strongest. It has the environment. Our culture of America is to find solutions. Our culture is a competitive one that allows people to do things in very different ways and experiment. It's not like other countries where the government says, you're going to do it this way, and that's the way it is. So I think we've got a great spirit. We have incredible challenges, but I think the premise is we have the best system, and we're evolving. It's very different today than it was even 5 years ago because of the financial crisis, and positive in many ways, a focus on more integrated solutions. So I think that's my first premise. We have a very, very strong system. We have got lots of work to do to meet the future challenges, but we have to be careful that we don't jeopardize the success and build off of that.
Oh, well, I'll second what you said, okay, but then I'm a born critic, so let's talk about, all right, yeah, so what are these challenges? I think we've had a huge investment in basic biomedical research, and actually I don't totally agree with you. I think we're now defining it too narrowly, because I do think we don't have the translational infrastructure in place that can easily and effectively evaluate that research and then bring it to patients and to consumers in an effective manner. And I think we are on the verge of a therapeutic revolution due to the discoveries in genomics and just molecular biology and plain old biology. And yet we have anemic translational and implementation, as was talked about in the last panel, arms to take all this fruits of all this research and all this investment and actually translate it actionably into to benefits for patients. So I think, in business and in government, we're supposed to talk about having a balanced portfolio so that we're not over spending on one area and then we end up not being effective because we've underfunded certain areas. And I think we are at the verge of recognizing or actually being, punished sort of for the lack of really substantive and systematic investment in translational infrastructure and then actually the implementation in people.
Can you just for the layperson who doesn't know what translational means,
Okay.
what are you talking about? What's an example of that?
So our great scientists in all the medical schools and labs around the country, okay, they discover new pathways that cause disease, okay, and then the industry picks that up perhaps and they develop targets maybe to a vaccine or a treatment for the disease, and then what do they have to do? Well, they have to go and find a way to evaluate that in people. And that's the most expensive, the slowest, and the most ineffective part of the process, right? And then once that's done, and you heard this in the last panel, they have to make sure that if there's this tremendous health breakthrough, say control of blood pressure, which has been around for a long time, okay, or control of cholesterol, that it actually is applied to people to benefit their health maximally, all right? So they're called different translational steps. One is evaluation, and then the other is application to people and making, actually making it happen. And these are not as strong. And so I think we're going to see all these discoveries, and then already we're seeing that the clinical evaluation is getting too expensive for companies to be able to afford it.
I would never disagree with a regulator. But I have to disagree a little bit. I mean, we're not going fast enough, but look, the NIH, Chris Austin and the folks there at Translational Medicine Centers to really do it. And I think you don't see as much because it doesn't get the visibility and the research doesn't get designated by that name. But I can't think of a company or an academic medical center that hasn't aggressively moved into this field because they realize they won't capitalize on it. So I'm more optimistic than you are that maybe it's not fast enough, but it is absolutely, the world is going that way in terms of investment dollars.
I'm not unoptimistic. I'm just ruthlessly
Right. No.
realistic,
Right.
okay? And we see all the clinical research, so we actually know what's going on at FDA and what ain't going on. So anyway, I'll stop there. We can talk about it later.
Absolutely, we will.
So going third, I have to agree with the previous two panelists. I mean, that's the safe
That's
place.
hard.
That's the safe place to be right now. It's hard to disagree with Bob's comments about the U.S. Ecosystem. I mean, we have the best infrastructure in the world, be it from world-class academic institution, access to capital, the biopharmaceutical industry, and our regulatory landscape has evolved fairly rapidly over the last 20 years. So that's wonderful. I do have to agree with Dr. Woodcock, though. I think that the way we test drugs in patients, the way we conduct clinical trials, has not advanced as fast as the way we do research and discovery.
Right.
And what that is presenting in the very near term is a problem, is the amount of capital that requires to go from the lab to the marketplace is requiring enormous investments. The timelines haven't gotten any shorter. And the system of incentives at the back end is under pressure, as we all know. So when you put all that together, I'm an optimist. I think that we do still have the best system in the world. I am absolutely convinced that we're going to find a way to fund this innovation, but I don't think it's going to be that simple. And I think we have to somehow become a lot more efficient in the way we conduct those clinical trials, which are the bulk of the investment takes place.
Well, I agree with everything that was said so far. But I think that in a more serious vein, I really think that one of the strengths that we have is our infrastructure. And what I mean by that, I mean the configuration of our research enterprise. The way we train scientists in this country is very methodical and has great promise for success on a very recurrent, repetitive basis. It's very rigorous. The way we conduct research, the design, the infrastructure is also very systematic and very methodical. There is a very rigorous peer review process. Not perfect, but it's very rigorous. There's a grant application process that's also relatively neutral and works very well. So again, it's not perfect. I would not even, there are ways that we could improve our system. But when one looks at other countries, where many of you have traveled, you realize that the way our research infrastructure and our enterprise is designed, from the training process to the actual practice, is very rigorous, and that is our strength. That is our strength. Now, where's our weakness? Our weakness is sustainability. And I'm sure we'll talk about it in much greater detail. And that is, as the previous one of the previous panelists mentioned, we have a roller coaster approach with our research programs, and that is not sustainable. Is not a successful, sustainable pathway. So that, I would say, is our negative. But let me stop here and give a chance to others to speak. But I do believe those are the strengths in its fundamental fabric, as well as the weakness being in sustainability.
Well, I'd like to follow up on something Dr. Woodcock said. So I'm sure that everyone would love if there was more money for medical research, both coming from government sources and also, in industry. But, the United States does make a very large investment in research. Are there ways that the money could be better spent? Are we over-investing in some areas and under-investing in others? Is translational medicine a place where we need to put more resources? How do you look at kind of the distribution of resources and the kinds of projects that are being funded or not funded?
Yeah. It's an important question. We're going to be in a resource-constrained environment for the rest of our business and lifetimes in any case. So we've got to figure out how to best do it. And some of it's a challenge, but I do think we have to experiment. And I'll give you an example. I think that one of the great advantages of the American system is that we allow MD Anderson to try it a certain way and Sloan Kettering to try it another way and try and find for the best solutions. But I do think we need to provide economic incentives for more collaboration so we don't have some of the redundancies that we have. So I think we have to do some of those things, that we provide incentives for organizations for private sector organizations. When you collaborate with academic medical centers, can you find 2 or 3 to do together? So that there are lots of initiatives going on that will help us be more efficient. So I do think we have to be ruthless to see, we don't want to lose the spirit, but we cannot overinvest in places where we're doing the same thing. So we've got to more transparency, more clarity on that, provide incentives for integrated research efforts and that. I'm sure there's many others.
Well, I have just a few little points I'd like to make, but they're probably number one. To the rigor, as you well know, a fair percentage of published results from basic biomedical research is not reproducible. That's a big problem. Okay, that's a rigor problem. All right, and it isn't a small percentage; it's a big percentage. Okay,
10%.
Pardon me. Okay, so I agree. 10. Well, the cancer center docs told me 70. Okay, so it depends on who you ask and what universe you're looking at, but it isn't minor. Number 2, we have to ask if certain areas of biomedical research are not overbuilt. Why? Because I get hundreds of applications from newly minted basic science postdocs, all of whom have been very rigorously trained and given like 8 years of their lives to post-graduating from college to get a PhD in molecular biology or something. I don't really have jobs for those people at the FDA. Now, other places do, but I'll bet you some of them are driving cabs in New York City. Okay, see, we really have to think about, rather than just say we need more of it, we have the best in the world. I agree. But, what are we being intentional in some ways? I agree we have to, competition and allowing different things is good, but really some of this enterprise, in my opinion, is overbuilt compared to other parts. And
What are the parts that are overbuilt?
Well, probably the there's an endless machine of basic biomedical research, okay? And, it has to, and if you have the pay line at age 40 and you make, those of you who are familiar with the story about the checkerboard, and you double each, you put twice as many on each square, and pretty soon you're like at an incredible amount. Well, that's kind of scheme, okay? If everybody has 5 postdocs, the next generation is going to be much bigger, right? So yeah, I think you have to think through things like that. And then the third thing is we are trying to really change how clinical evaluation is done. And we are trying to, we mean a coalition of people who feel that the current way that the clinical evaluation is not sustainable because it's too expensive and it's too inefficient. And that is, we're trying to turn the paradigm around and put standing protocols, master protocols, or clinical trial networks in place, fund those researchers kind of semi-permanently. Okay, and that's where Kathy would have been helpful, because the patient groups are helping us with this, because in their best interest, and build a machine that can rapidly do the clinical evaluation of many drugs, investigational drugs or vaccines or whatever coming through, so that you don't build a new clinical trial or set of clinical trials for every single investigational drug. You have a standing infrastructure that can do that. So I've probably talked enough, and I have, of course, very controversial opinions.
I see Dr. Reese shaking his head, so I want to give him the next.
I don't entirely disagree, but I believe that there is something fundamental to our system. I mean, as I said, the fundamental framework, I believe, is one of the best. The fundamental framework. I don't
disagree.
And that, I think, is our strength, and we ought to acknowledge that and celebrate that. But here is what I think is a problem for us, and that is no one runs a business, a home, and anything without a predictable source of revenue. And our system does not have a predictable. I mean, there is a.
That's our whole industry.
That's right.
There are always exceptions.
Yes, we'll take it as an exception.
And the problem is that we have boom or bust. Boom or bust. There are times, and again, with research, to get young people trained, it takes many, many years. And if there isn't a method by which you can maintain them, they'll be gone to something. And then when there's a boom again, another decade from now, there's no way to get them back. And it takes a while. So it's a constant roller coaster, and I mean huge swings. So I do believe that is a major issue that we have in our system, and that is the lack of predictability in terms of how we fund. Again, it doesn't have to be precise, but there's this huge boom, and there's a bust, there's a doubling, and then it's a major problem.
I have to add something to this because I think I worry about us giving the wrong impression here, that we have to be efficient in all of our ecosystem, in the whole ecosystem we're talking about here. But we let the debate get away from us if that's the debate. We do not spend enough on R&D broadly defined as a society to deal with the problems that we're facing. The Alzheimer's issue, the metabolic disease issue, the cancer issue, all the demographic curve is so against us, and the innovation needs to be accelerated, not rationed down. So we shouldn't let anybody be confused. This discussion of efficiency and improvement is absolutely essential to justify more investment, but we need more investment. And that's why I was a little discouraged by even the panel before, that we need as a group to be more effective with specific plans that are going to reduce the cost of healthcare in areas where we should be reducing it. Improving digital health, getting the Congressional Budget Office to recognize that prevention and wellness does score, as opposed to preventing any congressman from voting for prevention because the Congressional Budget Office will give it only a cost and no benefit into the 10-year cycle. We have to be talking about how to reduce the costs of healthcare, make it more value-oriented in the areas that don't affect the future of solving the problems. And so I'm glad to participate in this panel, but this is not an acceptance that we need to reduce the amount of R&D. We need to fix healthcare broadly defined in the best way it can. We need to invest more here, even if we have not so perfect world and we operate.
I completely agree. Look, a system that is fundamentally based on competition, whether it is two postdocs competing for an R01 or two companies competing for a share of the market, by definition is going to have some overlap and inefficiencies. And it's very dangerous to try to understand or to pretend that we understand exactly how to fix those inefficiencies and go proactively. I think that one of the things that Bob mentioned, we fundamentally have a healthcare system that has some of the incentives, if not most of the incentives, in the wrong place, which is to deliver care. And as a result of that, I think that, yes, we are seeing an efficiency in the system because more money is spent in areas that provide minimal benefit as opposed to things like prevention and keeping people healthy, which is not incentivized the right way. So I'm not sure whether some parts of the ecosystem are overbuilt, but I certainly see areas for improvement such as those.
Look at the regulatory system. How is that changing, and how does that need to change? Do we, is it keeping up with the way that science is developing with more personalized medicine and, more development of drugs and other treatments that address small populations?
Oh, she has to go first.
No,
I was going to go first. Come on, let's not kid around.
On the flip
Well,
side, too, do you feel that you have the resources that you need in order to accomplish these new things and to keep up?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's a resource issue as much as it is we have to evolve our policies rapidly. What we're going to see in medicine, to some extent for pharmaceuticals, is we're going to see them targeted at smaller, more genetically defined or other biomarker defined populations. And so we're going to see larger treatment effects, and we're probably drugs that are somewhat safer because they're targeted toward the people and toward the pathways that are out of whack in whatever disease it might be, okay? And that's a whole different paradigm than large drugs that treat like a zillion people and anybody, all comers should be treated. And so especially for the very closely genetically targeted drugs where only one mutation in a gene might be the candidate for that drug. We're going to transition phase right now, and that's, it creates policy challenges. Now, a government doesn't have competitive salary, so that's another issue. All right, that's just a broad issue about attracting the most up-to-date and the best talent to deal with these. But I think it's really, we're seeing a shift in how drugs are developed, and they're very intentionally developed toward genotypes or specific phenotypes in a much more targeted way. And people call that precision medicine or personalized medicine, but that shift is upon us right now.
Do you need different processes to address those kinds of innovations?
Yeah, we need to make the policies. We don't need new legislation, I don't think, or anything like that. We simply need to evolve our policies, understand the science that we're regulating, so we're not doing that blind, and make sure the policies match the kind of therapies that are evolving?
So drugs have been developed now differently than they were 25 years ago, and this is going to continue to change very rapidly, specifically in oncology, whether it is through targeting specific molecular defects in cancer or specific targets on the cell surface or both. We are going to continue to evolve. There's a lot of examples already out there. I think what we need, one of the things that could certainly be improved is all the great work that Dr. Woodcock has done in CDER should extend to CDRH and coordination between those two agencies as we more and more have to develop many of our new medicines with a companion diagnostic. And I don't think that is yet where it should be. And so my plea to Dr. Woodcock is, again, to extend all the great work that CDER has done to update a regulatory framework for approving medicines to approving co-diagnostics in combinations with those medicines.
Fair enough. I mean, don't forget the genetic diagnostic field is changing very rapidly, and those changes are upon us with next generation sequencing. Pretty soon we don't have to just take tiny little samples of your genes if you're getting a genetic test. We can get your whole genome sequence, all right, at once, and it'll be affordable. And so that is a game changer for diagnostics, in my opinion. And we really need to figure out how to use that as a platform technology, because pretty soon, in 10 years, you could see many people will be genotyped.
I have to disagree with Dr. Woodcock about something. I think there is need for legislation.
Okay.
And I think the 21st Century Cures Act that Chairman Upton and Congresswoman DeGette are working on is an opportunity to take a very rigorous, fresh look at things. I think, and I agree with what you said, I think there are things that we should consider in this, and I know that people are participating and are getting ideas out there. Why are drugs part of the Food and Drug, and why are drugs and food together? Why are the funding for the FDA out of the Agriculture Department? Why is the FDA not legislatively authorized the same way certain parts of the NIH are to be exempted from government pay scales and things? So I think there are absolutely legislative things that we should be taking a very fresh look at things. And so I think there are funding opportunities, organizational design issues that would give the FDA even more independence, more capability to advance the reforms that you're talking about. So I would argue that we have an opportunity now, and we should be very aggressively challenging the whiteboard as opposed to saying the changes are acceptable, because I think we all know we want better, and we're the best, but we want better. I am a little concerned that we also, if we're able to accelerate the pace of change that you're talking about and leading, we have to be careful that we're not going to have a revolution and change things because we're in the middle of so many things under one set of standards, and all of a sudden we change things. So we've got an opportunity, I think, to look more aggressively than we've ever looked before under the environment of the 21st Century Cures Act in a very positive way that would enhance the FDA and make sure that we continue the advances outside of that.
Yeah, well, I don't think you're disagreeing with me. I was really talking about
I was kidding about this, but I don't.
Regulatory standards, not sort of organizational structure, management, all those sorts of things, different issue.
Right. No.
Do you think that there needs to be changes in regulatory standards?
I think the world has changed totally, right? I think that we all agree with that. I think that the challenge is the science where it needs to be so we can have confidence in the biomarkers that tell us that is going to be the ultimate outcome, and so we're advancing very quickly. The standards have to change. We cannot pay $1.5 billion to develop a drug when only 2 out of 10 drugs ever reach the commercial potential to pay off the investment. 2 out of 10, 15 years, you gotta be kidding me. We have to make changes as a society, otherwise we won't produce the solutions for the Alzheimer's, the cancers, the metabolic diseases, and we just won't make the investment. Who wants to put money up front when the odds are so stacked against you? We've got to encourage people to invest more in risky ventures by making them a little less risky and getting the answers more quickly. So we have to. It's just how we do it and when we do it.
But do you think that's regulatory, or now I'm going to seem to switch my position? Okay, the reason we're having so much success now in cancer drugs, okay, and antivirals. Why is that? It's because of 30 years of focused research in those areas. The war on cancer started a really long time ago, and everybody was there like, when's, we can get something out of this, right? Well, it's bearing fruit now. That war on cancer, we understand the pathogenic mechanisms of cancer. We're beginning to elucidate all the targets. We can sequence the genes of a person's cancer, determine what's driving that tumor, and then choose the correct intervention to intervene in that. And so in that sense, I think we definitely have to push. I don't think us regulators saying, oh, we're going to have different standards for Alzheimer's is going to do it. We need the fundamental research findings that will give us the biomarkers and give us the targets so we understand how to intervene in Alzheimer's. That's
Most important, I agree with you. That's first and foremost.
Dr. Reese, do you
Yeah, I just want to confirm. I just want to follow up on something that Bob said, which I totally agree with. I think that there is a need for some review of our regulatory process. Again, we have sort of accepted our regulatory processes over the years, and we've sort of built on it, and it becomes like an onion where we just sort of build on it. I do believe that it has served us well. I don't want to knock that, but at the same time, I think to the extent that we can use the new legislation, or one of the things I want to compliment FDA on is the new era of regulatory science as a means by which they can maybe partner with your universities and try to study what approaches may be used in order to accelerate the pace or modify some of the regulations. I do think that it is something that becomes, at the present time, may inhibit or impede to some extent those who may wish to fast track drugs. So I think that it's something that needs to be reviewed. And this, I do agree with Bob that there needs to be review legislation regarding how we can be helpful to FDA to make certain the processes are more compatible with faster cures, faster processes, not to the extent of injuring patients, but efficiencies. And I do believe that could be looked at.
So we're just talking about big breakthroughs in oncology and in antiviral drugs, and certainly there have been quite a few over these last few years that have been very important in helping certain populations, but they've also been tremendously expensive, very large price tags attached to these drugs. And there's been some of a backlash in the oncology space. And most recently, I think there's been just a lot of public conversation about Sovaldi and the cost of treating hepatitis C. And I guess I'm just curious about how you guys view this environment. To what degree is the ability to charge a very high price for a very effective drug that that is potentially a real scientific breakthrough? Does that motivate you and make it able for you to get through this risky process? And to what degree do you worry that drugs are becoming so expensive that it's harmful for the healthcare system, or it limits access for patients who may not have the ability to pay?
Well, I spent an hour on this because I think it's a fundamental question and a very important one, and I think we look at this in an inappropriate way. I think that if we're talking about research, first of all, we have to recognize that the only way a pharmaceutical company gets any money to invest in research, not government funding, it comes from the reimbursement of products. So it's a very complex equation, and there's no doubt that every drug should be value. It should be value. We need to look at the value proposition. If you can't justify the impact of it, you shouldn't be able to charge that price. So let's think about a few things, right? If someone discovered a capsule you could take that would cure cure cancer, a certain cancer, what would we charge for that? What would we charge for it? So we're talking about, and I'm not here to defend any specific company. We don't have anything that cures hepatitis C or anything, unfortunately. But the cost and the benefit, you have to remember also the way we look at this, the economic impact that our country has benefited from this whole system is overall, the economic impact is a very positive one. One of the reasons the U.S. economy has fared better even in the last 5 years over Europe is because we do a better job of encouraging risk-taking, do better access to medicines than other countries. So there's an incredible important value proposition that has to be determined. We should never be embarrassed to talk about it because there is such rigor in all systems about price. It's not like free pricing. Maybe there's a couple examples, but you don't get paid if you don't make a big impact on patients. So I think we have to make sure we talk about this in the right way, that there has to be a value proposition. We need to support it. And let's also remember, let's take cancer, for example. In 1970, the cost of oncology drugs was about 1% of healthcare spending in America. Last year, the cost of oncology drugs was less than 1% of healthcare spending. Pharmaceutical overall absolute dollars have virtually been flat the last 3 or 4 years. Per capita pharmaceutical spending down 3.7%. We invent so many freaking generics. 85% of drugs dispensed in America are generics.
86%
Yeah.
as of last year.
We discovered those generics. No generic company discovered a generic. You wouldn't have those low-cost drugs if we hadn't invested in R&D and made them. When you put all that cost together, we're letting people, because we restructured the insurance system very inappropriately and put caps on things. We put the wrong incentives for low premiums and deny access to patients with 50% copay. Every AIDS drug is on a specialty tier under the exchange programs. Do you know in Texas, under every exchange program, 77% of those programs exclude MD Anderson from cancer care from patients in the working poor that are under those exchanges. In New York City, 81% of the New York exchange insurance programs exclude Sloan Kettering from care. In the state of Washington, 100% of the exchange programs exclude the Fred Hutch Cancer Center from those. It's discriminatory against the working poor. It leads to terrible care. And they focus on the price of the drug but it's not, it's still branded pharmaceuticals are 8% of total healthcare costs. We've got to get together to support the NIH, to support good reimbursement, insurance reform. We need success in the whole system. And I think that we allow people to talk about, and I have a slide in the speech I gave University of Virginia yesterday. We've been talking about drug prices since 1860 in the New York Times about drug prices being too high. Anyway, I don't really care about this issue that much, but it's the same with the overall research thing. We don't invest enough in people should take more drugs. The CBO 2 years ago finally came out and said, we got to get them to change about prevention and wellness. Well, a miracle happened. The CBO said when prescription drug uses rise, other medical costs go down. And they used the most conservative, ridiculous estimate. But that's what's happening. They finally changed that. More drugs lead lower healthcare costs. We got the debate all wrong because we want to talk about Lindsay Lohan and rehab instead of Alzheimer's research and development or drug price of something that gets somebody's headlines, and we don't really talk about the substantive issues about access to good medicines for patients leads to better economic productivity, leads to investments for our solutions for our society. We have this discussion ass backwards, let me tell you.
Dr. Newman, I mean, is that the problem? Is it just that there needs to be better communication about value, or are some of these prices too high?
I think there's a legitimate debate, right, that one could say, are we rewarding innovation the right way, right? I do happen to think that the critical point here is innovation in drug discovery and development has to continue to be incentivized. And any discussion that leads to the wrong changes in changing that set of incentives that Bob described, it's going to be a big problem. Let's just take a couple of examples, and you can take, I'm sure everybody in the room has their favorite one. You can take chronic myelogenous leukemia. A partnership from a lot of academic research with a lot of pharmaceutical investment has made a disease that was uniformly fatal without a bone marrow transplant into something as a chronic disease. 85% of the patients are alive at 10 years. Take multiple myeloma, a disease that Bob's company and our company focus on. Used to be fatal in 3.5 years. Now the survival of patients with newly diagnosed myeloma is probably over 10 years. These are concrete advances that have been delivered through the system we have in place that we started the panel discussing, which requires massive amounts of capital investment at risk. There's no other way to get to that point. So now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that every single medicine launched by the pharmaceutical industry provides true benefit. We agree. And probably those shouldn't be rewarded the same way others have provided real benefit. So it's about value, the value proposition of the medicines we develop.
Yeah, well, I think there are three things that can be done, actually, about this, leaving aside the debate. A long time ago, a decade ago, Mark McClellan and I put out a paper called The Critical Path to Drugs, pointing out that with all the biomedical discovery that was going on, unless we changed the costs and efficiencies of drug development, we may have not have any innovation, or if we have innovation, we might not be able to afford it, okay? And so other things that can be done that we've been working on, number one, of course, we have to keep investing in the biomedical research enterprise, because it's the uncertainty that leads to the fact that only 2 out of 10 end up getting on the market. We don't have enough predictive value from biomedical science to design the right drugs, okay, right away from the get-go. So nobody builds airplanes and 8 out of 10 are going to fall out of the sky, right? We hope not, okay? But that's the state here, that many drop by the way, and it's very expensive. Number two, that we need to, as I said earlier, we ought to decrease the cost of the clinical evaluation by setting up networks and other standing protocols, and so into these investigational drugs can be evaluated very efficiently. And then number three, I think, well, sounds like you need to move on, but I think there are many things that can be done, in fact, that will improve the efficiency. We can also improve, and no one's brought this up because nobody's interested in this, but I'm very interested in it. The cost of manufacturing these drugs is extreme, and new advanced manufacturing methods can actually cut costs by a tremendous amount. And the FDA is really going to go on a very big effort to do that, but we will require public partnerships to get that done.
So I want to make sure we have enough time for questions, and especially want to hear from patients and consumers who feel that their voice is not included in this panel. So yes, over here in the front. I think there's a microphone coming.
My name is Herb Partis. I'm the Executive Vice Chair of New York Presbyterian Hospital. I want to just raise one comment. There was comments before about redundant laboratories, and I'm sure that you want to be cautious that you don't wind up with a system in which you have too few laboratories investigating. We've been down the road of one laboratory producing a result which then was found to be wrong when other laboratories got in. So I would assume, I'd raise the question as to whether you might not think that there's a balancing act there, not excessive, but not too narrow. And let me just make one other point, and that is that I also appreciate some of the comments about some things that have gone better. And there are costs being taken out by people in many different sectors of the healthcare world. The teaching hospitals agreed to a $155 billion reduction in costs when the Obamacare was put in place, and we are doing that, and that's costing, example, at our place, $1 billion is being taken out. Other places, the same thing. I think sometimes we get so hooked on this notion of it's cost, 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 that we fail to recognize that there is some progress being made.
Yes, over here.
So Atul Butte from Stanford did the plenary at our annual meeting this summer, and he was asked to focus on the educational and the clinical and the research implications of big data. And he talked quite a bit about the phenomenon of pooled data from publicly funded research and whatnot. And I haven't drilled deeply into that topic yet to know how it actually is playing out in your various sectors.
So the day before yesterday, I was asked to sit in a roundtable for the Personalized Medicine Coalition, and this was the question, how big data is going to impact what we do. For me, it's very clear that there's two areas where I see big data playing out. One is the way we do research and discovery. I can understand how the ability to analyze and compile massive amounts of data and multiple permutations will lead to better targets and better understanding on a molecular basis of disease across the board. And I can understand how big data can be utilized at the back end in terms of access and how drugs are actually utilized in the marketplace. My concern, first of all, I think this, at least in the back end, is coming and is coming fast. I think the question is, how is it going to be utilized? Is it going to be utilized to make sure that we use the drugs we have, the medicines we have, the right way in the right patients? That is obviously a welcome advance. Or is it going to be utilized to circumvent the regulatory system, which already assigns which patients are supposed to receive a certain medicine for their disease? Are we going to get around the regulatory system with the utilization of big data or not? I don't know the answer to that, but that is one concern that I would put, and I would love to hear Dr. Woodcock's opinion. Now, in the middle part, which, as we discussed earlier in the panel, I think we have the fundamental problem of timelines are too long, inefficiencies, and cost. Despite discussions with many big data companies, I'm still not convinced that big data can address the fundamental problems that we have. But I'm waiting to hear that answer.
Dr. Woodcock, do you have big
Sure.
ambitions for big data?
Well, to me, that's kind of a buzzword. It always gets me a little hostile because, you know, people should say what they mean, not you, okay, but you heard about it. I have lots of people coming to me, too. Oh, big data. Like we have the Sentinel network, okay, that we have built. It has 150 million lives, has the healthcare information of 150 million lives that we can query behind the firewall, so this personal privacy is maintained. And we're using that, and even my greatest skeptic, Bob Temple, who is the Mr. Methodologist, randomized controlled trial, said we can use this system to find safety signals after marketing, okay, and to assess them. So we are already, that is up and running. We are advertising the contract for this actual Sentinel system, which will be even larger, and we will be able to query very rapidly, and when a drug is launched, we'll be able to pull the information and the experience from the patients who are taking it and see if anything untoward or the things that we had not predicted. So that's a very early win, I think. I agree also on the molecular side, we still don't understand how people get disease and what their genes have to do with that in general, right, except in very small instances. So there's going to be a revolution. It's already coming out in the medical journals where they're looking at this and that, and they're finding the gene that's causing this rare thing or that. And they're going to try to do that on a very large scale to figure out on a population scale what is the relationship between genotype and what happens to you. And that's going to be very interesting. But it's not, I agree, it's not going to help drug development it'll provide perhaps many more targets. But if we have this constriction in the middle that costs $1.5 billion to assess whether the drug is effective or not, well, that's a pretty small thing to get through, and big data is not going to help us there.
I think the broader question about technology is incredibly important. I think we've already seen the value of, when you think about the financial services industry, 1980, technology was finally applied to the financial service, and you end up securitization, derivatives, and you saw tremendous growth of that industry. And then it became a commodity, and it's one of the reasons why the financial service industry has to struggle for revenue growth, is that it's a commodity now. We are finally bringing technology to the healthcare world, and one of the reasons I am optimistic that we will get control of costs, et cetera. Finally, the whole technology industry realizes this is 17-18% of GDP, and we're in the 1950s with technology generally. We can make so much more of the value of our techniques, our products, to be able to understand really what value is, understand what the costs are in our system. We're going to be able to care for people so much better. I think 10 years from now, our lives will be so fundamentally different. What we know about our own health and how technology impacts both the prevention, the wellness, the care of people, and all of the different aspects of being able to provide care in a more cost-effective, more value-oriented way. Technology is a big, big part of the next 10 years of the crisis that we face. And will help hopefully leave money for leaving R&D, to add more money to R&D. That's the goal.
Dr. Reese, did you
Yeah, I want to make just a few points. One to follow up on Bob was saying. First of all, I do believe that the wave of technology that is really going across the country, let's say the electronic medical records, for example, that is being installed in virtually all major hospitals throughout the United States. That is going to have a significant impact. I mean, this is relatively, even though we knew that it was an important aspect, it's a relatively newly adopted or embraced. That's the first point. The second one, I think, is one that Dr. Pardis raised earlier regarding trying to take out the cost out of the system. And I'm very skeptical about this wave of trying to reduce costs and reduce costs. It's always good to be efficient. Nobody can argue about that. But I think that our system trying to focus so heavily on trying to reduce costs from a research enterprise, and I'm referring now to the research enterprise, we could potentially do that at our peril. Simply because this is the research in this country, research doesn't pay for itself. And I'm referring to in an academic setting, research does not pay. it has to be supplemented with margins from clinical dollars. So if there is further diminution in funding for research, for example, that has to be further supplemented by dollars from elsewhere. And for the academic institutions like my own, for example, we fund research. It's an important aspect of who we are. But it depends, it requires a certain level of funding. So to the extent that we can be investing in research, and again, if we want to continue to have our leadership role, we have to at least be competitive with our competitors. China, Russia, the BRIC countries, for example. The pace of research investment is several orders of magnitude above ours, several orders. So at some point, and there's a prediction that we will fall behind. At the present time, we're enjoying some leadership role, but if we do not continue to invest in it. So I'm very skeptical about this very, very heavy emphasis on reduction in our expenses.
Yes, back here. Oh, we were, sorry, the microphone's already.
Hi, my name is Linda House. I represent the cancer support community. Thank you all for your feedback and your comments here today. I have a question. When I think about the topic of this panel in particular, speaking about research as an ecosystem, and we've alluded to in the previous panel depression and the importance of impacting depression. We know from Barbara Anderson's research out of The Ohio State University that women who go through just a 26-session support group not only reduce their risk of recurrence for breast cancer by 50%, those who do recur reduce the risk of death by 50%, and those who do die from their breast cancer live 1.3 years longer than those who aren't in the intervention arm. If that were a drug, that would cost a lot of money. We also know from Linda Carlson's data out of Canada that psychosocial intervention reduces overall cost of care by about 25%. So when I think about the ecosystem of research, and particularly drug device development, and Janet, I'm sort of coming to you because at some point in time I'd like to have a conversation with you about how do we make this really happen in your organization. How do we get to a point that in addition to companion diagnostics, we also incorporate psychosocial research alongside of development of solutions?
Well, I think the problem you're alluding to, though, has to do with the adoption of demonstrated beneficial interventions that are not conventional medical products, okay? And our healthcare system is poorly designed. In my field, in rheumatology, it's the same way. We know that there are certain types of interventions that really improve osteoarthritis and so forth. However, often the patients are given opioids, which, as we all know, is not really the best thing for them, right? And research has shown that. So it's that final translational arm, translation into practice, that it's less of the research than actually how do we make this happen? And that's sort of what you're asking me. Can we piggyback it onto drug development so that then it'll happen, at least in those trials? And, you know, I think some of those things are possible. We're starting to try to incorporate patient-reported outcomes, more patient-centered measures in drug development so that we understand the real, talk about value, it has to be value to the patient, and we understand the actual impact on the disease and on the quality of life of the person. So where there are proven effective interventions that are not being used because they're unconventional, that's a really interesting question, but I think it does show this other translational gap that we have in care.
Well, thank you so much to all the panelists and to everyone for being here. This has been wonderful.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Can you share?
I think you'd have to agree that our panelists on all three panels have given us a lot to think about. There's plenty of straight talk, a lot of passion, a little bit of disagreement, a little edge. I'm not going to attempt to sum up what we heard, but we will be highlighting key points on our website and otherwise, and this has all been taped and can be accessed, so you can go back and take a look. But I think we did hear some things that are pretty important and pretty I would say definitely critical for us to all embrace. We're not the healthiest nation that we can be or that we want to be. We're not. So how are we going to get there? Transformational change is overdue. About health in a lot of ways, I would say, but the point was made, and I think it was Dr. Fauci who did this in such a powerful way, that transformational change in how this nation prioritizes research, discovery, is essential. And getting to that point is a goal worth pursuing. We also have to get across the simple truth that public health and prevention is a best buy. It's a best buy. We have to tell that story better, more effectively, with a lot of impact. We have a crying need to change some parts of our current ecosystem, not wholesale, carefully. But there is some room for improvement. And we need success in the whole system, in the whole ecosystem. We've got to have success all together. And that means we have to stand shoulder to shoulder. Every aspect of the research ecosystem, if you will, starting with the patient groups, academia, industry, scientists themselves, the public health community, government. We have to stand shoulder to shoulder, learn how to make each other's case as well as our own, not point fingers across the ecosystem, but take it on together and tell our story in a combined, high-impact, relentless way. I think if we do that, it will be irresistible, and we'll get to that transformational vision that I'm pretty sure everybody in this room shares and cares about. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for being part of Research America. Thank you for what you do every day, because life is why. And that I thank the American Heart Association for. But thank you again and again. Talk to us all the time at Research America. That's why we're here. We're proud to work for you. Bye-bye. Thank you, thank you, thank you.